Okay, we're 2 minutes past the hour. We'll get going. Thanks for attending. I'm Brad Keats, a member of the Innovative Technologies team at Canada Health InfoWay, and I'd like to thank you for joining today. This is the second of 5 webinars that InfoWay's put together on the topic of AI governance in the healthcare setting in Canada. By the way, we've just started an opening poll. I'm hoping that you can just spend a minute right here at the beginning taking a quick look at it. 2 quick questions. It'll close in a few minutes, so take a look when you get a moment. These 5 webinars are in support of a toolkit that Canada Health InfoWay soft launched in December of 2021. The link and the QR code for the toolkit are on the screen. If you haven't done so already, go take a look. They're available in both French and English in the one big module and a couple of individual modules for each one of the toolkit pieces, as well as a really interesting set of appendices and other resource material. We can move to the next page. Our webinars were created with healthcare delivery organizations in mind, in particular those who are implementing AI solutions as opposed to doing research in AI or doing development in AI. And in particular, they're focused at healthcare delivery groups, maybe in a hospital, maybe in a clinic, maybe in a primary care setting, a long-term group setting like that. And there's likely many things that are going to be interesting to many people, but that's the focus area. Implementation for those just starting the journey, thinking about AI and governance in healthcare. We had an introduction webinar last week. It was well attended, many questions. We couldn't even get to them all. We're going to figure out a way to handle that. And it was about just overall the landscape, what it looks like, some things to think about, particularly from a risk and an approach perspective. Today, we're going to talk about emerging regulation of AI and a super interesting topic, lots of conversation, moving quite quickly. Next Thursday, and all these webinars are on Thursdays from 12 to 1, we'll be talking about how to identify the right type of opportunity within your organization. Is your organization ready? If it's not ready, how you might want to look at it. I think it's a pretty interesting one, particularly if you're just beginning your AI journey. February 24th, we'll look at in detail some of the key risks in AI. Things like, how do you identify data bias? How do you explain it? How do you approach things like algorithmic explainability? Some of the new risks that begin to show up and some of the approaches there. And in our toolkit, we take the approach of looking at best practices and checklists. So that'll be quite an interesting one. And then March 3rd, we'll end with one of the best parts of the webinar series, and as well as one of the most interesting parts of the toolkit, just overall AI governance, roles, structures, responsibilities. That's my favorite one for what that's worth. It's jam-packed full of information. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple of things. This webinar is being recorded, just so you're aware. We'd like you to submit questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar, and we'll be answering those questions at the end of the webinar. We set aside 20 minutes to get that done. Based on some feedback we got at the first webinar, we've provided a link for some pre-reading for this webinar, and we'll do the same thing for other webinars. I think that'll help. One of the things about this particular webinar and this particular part of the toolkit, but likely applies to all of them, is we will be covering matters that are legal or legalistic, or they kind of feel like they're legal items, but we're not offering professional advice. We're giving you a kind of overview of what's going on. And I just wanted to make sure if you need to get into those areas, that's a different topic for a different time. If we could move to the next slide. We'll also be offering simultaneous translation in French. Forward, you click the interpretation button, and then you click French, and you have to mute the original audio as we move through. So hopefully that will work for everybody. And if we go to the next slide, without further ado, let me introduce Carol Peterson. She's been instrumental in helping us understand how to approach this space in developing the toolkit. She's been a great resource to work with as we're going through it. And I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and Carol, have fun. And we're looking for everybody's questions. And thanks a lot, guys. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Brad. And thank you to the InfoWay team. I am just taking note of the poll results before I get started, which I always find so fascinating to understand sort of who's in the audience and what is the level of general maturity when it comes to artificial intelligence. So it's interesting to me that we've got about 60% of respondents in this poll that are saying that they are currently implementing or thinking of implementing an AI-enabled solution within a healthcare delivery setting. So this, it's no surprise, I suppose, that the audience that's attending this particular seminar is already underway and starting to, at the very least, think about some of these solutions and how it may apply in healthcare. We've got 40% that say no, they're not even thinking about it right now. So maybe there's something here that will stimulate some of that thought. In terms of how much experience do you have? The majority are saying not very much. And I think we only have about 4% of respondents that say more than 3 years experience implementing AI-enabled solutions. So another great, really interesting to set the tone for today's webinar, to recognize who's in the audience, the general level of experience, and that will certainly shape the way I present some of this information. So welcome to everyone who's here. Thank you for coming. As Brad indicated, this is a 5-part series that covers many of the key topics that are featured in the modules in the InfoWay AI for Implementation Toolkit. And the way I really think about this is that we're very much on a journey. We're on a journey to move from ideas to implementation, experimentation to adoption, broad-based adoption. And as a result, we really need to work through a lot of the questions that we have in framing the way we think about advanced technologies, in deconstructing some of those elements. What are the data considerations? What are the intellectual property considerations? What are some of the contracting considerations? What do the use cases look like? What is in the liability implications? So really unpacking some of the steps in our road or in our journey from idea to implementation, and also thinking practically about what does it mean to effectively shepherd sort of a larger scale, more experimental advanced technology project within a healthcare setting that is typically on the more conservative side in protecting the patient, protecting the data. And so really excited to have you on this journey with us. And today what we're going to be covering particularly is some of the emerging regulation. This is a fascinating topic, particularly for me as a lawyer that practices in this space. I'm very excited to see what's coming down the pike, but also to analyze some of these consistent themes as we look at what is the legislature or what are policymakers worried about? Why are they worried about those things? And what are they doing or what are they suggesting should be done to put parameters in place to protect all of us from some of these risks or associated harms that emerge with such advanced technologies? So we're going to start just again to level set. If you read the toolkit on artificial intelligence that InfoWay has made public, you'll note that different modules have different intended audiences. Sometimes the audience is geared to more of the administration level within a healthcare setting. Sometimes it's a very broad audience. It's meant to be general information that's really intended to spark discussion, generate ideas, level the playing field so that there can be some organization within or some coordination within your organization to around the areas of artificial intelligence. So this particular module is intended for a broader audience. It is really intended as a survey, a landscape, and again, to level set so we all understand what the environment looks like, the regulatory environment looks like, and it feeds directly from module 1, where we were level setting on what is artificial intelligence and where are there opportunities to use AI in the healthcare setting. So the learning objectives for today focus on understanding the emerging legal and policy environment for AI, what makes AI unique at law, and then what are some opportunities to proactively comply with AI. That last part, I just want to, as a bit of a spoiler alert, that last part will be covered particularly in the module on AI governance as well. So we'll pick up that theme again in module 5 at the end. I think that's on March 3rd. Okay. So emerging laws in AI. So the first thing that we really need to understand is, why are we talking, like what specifically makes artificial intelligence unique at law, or why is the law particularly worried about AI? And the point that I always come to when I'm discussing this particular issue is that artificial intelligence as a technology is capable of assessing and analyzing the data environment in which it's situated, or the data that it's exposed to, and then reacting to that data environment. I think that's the best way to put it. Sometimes that reaction, or as I like to talk about it, as the output, so what the system ultimately produces, sometimes that output is totally unintended or unexpected. And that's where we see different sources of risk from a legal perspective. The fact that there is an independent analysis of the data, that there is an output based on that data. It's usually a prediction, a trend recognition. It may be a specific classification. So it may assist in a decision. So there is some output that is relied upon, and sometimes we can't understand why that output is what it is, or how the system generated that particular output based on the data that it analyzed. So that independent nature of data analysis, and the fact that there is a meaningful output that can have a direct impact on end users, or in some cases, direct output on particular patients, this all starts to raise specific concerns at law, where we look and we say, well, are there structures in place? Is there accountability there? Is there sufficient transparency to ensure that the process of the AI system and the ultimate output is being used in a responsible manner that won't be discriminatory or harmful against individuals? And is there sufficient capacity to understand that process so that whoever is on that receiving end of the output knows how to weigh its strengths and weaknesses and use it in an appropriate manner? So that's where we find the law really struggling, and where we start to see a number of different policies, guidance documents, and ultimately regulation emerging. So I want to talk about that for a moment, because the policy discussion around AI risk mitigation now has been really vibrant for at least 5 to 7 years. Concerns around the ethical use cases, discrimination in artificial intelligence that's processing a large amount of historic data without proper oversight and analysis of that data. Those historic biases then find their way into, future-looking predictive outputs of the system. So there really is a sort of robust debate around, well, what kind of accountability is required? What type of testing is required? How do we make sure that these systems are not going to perpetuate our historic biases? How do we correct those historic biases instead? So we see a lot of discussion in the policy realm around that. Increasingly, we are seeing governments turn to regulation. So the discussion around regulation has been happening for years, but actually starting to put pen to paper is relatively new. I'll give you some examples that are all within the last, year at most. So we've seen the EU table draft regulations called the Artificial Intelligence Act. It's getting more and more debate, actually. So that was in April 2021 when it was first released, but it's getting more and more debate because there is a push to try to render that law, give that law legal effect by November 2022 or early 2023, which is record speed for law. And so we've got that particular draft regulation that really looks at risk mitigation and risk assessment, impact assessment for providers and users of AI systems. We see the Federal Trade Commission in the US that has come out with some guidance around fair practices for artificial intelligence and expectations of transparency, accountability, fairness, non-discrimination in AI design and deployment. So through that entire life cycle. And we've seen the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US also put forward, a concept paper for artificial intelligence risk assessment frameworks. So really interesting to see what's going to come out of those two jurisdictions. China has also tabled a pretty comprehensive law on what they're calling algorithmic recommendation service providers. So touching on this theme of automated decision systems that we're going to see in the Canadian context in just a second. So really, when you're looking around the world, there are a number of different major players who are putting forward comprehensive, either self-regulatory mechanisms like the concept paper we see coming out of NIST, or strict sort of prescriptive regulation as we see coming out of the EU and China. If we bring it home, bring it to Canada, then we also see signs of movement in the world of regulating artificial intelligence. And some great examples of this is out of Quebec. The reform to their private sector privacy law has incorporated elements that are very well aligned with what we find out of Europe's general data protection regulation. And that is particularly regulating around automated profiling based or profiling based on fully automated systems. So that's being incorporated with positive obligations on organizations to demonstrate transparency and accountability and demonstrate explainability of those systems. Do we understand why the system issued a particular output? So that's quite interesting. In November of 2020, oh gosh, I'm getting my COVID months all mixed up. But we saw Canada table draft law to reform our federal private sector privacy law, which incorporated specific elements of regulating automated decision systems, also with positive obligations associated with those systems. So note the trend of, a concern to do with any type of system that will have or render a prediction or a decision that will impact an individual, and how that's defined actually changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So we see this and we always have to ask ourselves, well, why is this happening? Why is the government starting to regulate this? We've talked about it a little bit. But actually what we also find is that, themes around trustworthiness, accountability, transparency, and value alignment are becoming front and center in that regulation discussion. And these are the consistent themes that we're going to talk about a little bit more. These are the consistent themes that we see at the global level and the national level, providing some guidance around what good AI looks like, or you'll hear this more and more, what trustworthy AI should look like, or what responsible AI should look like. So I'll advance to the next. So along this line of the themes that are coming into focus, for a number of years now, we've seen academic discussion, we've seen discussion in the civil society sector, in industry associations, multilateral institutions that have really tried to touch on where are there specific concerns that we can ultimately be a little bit more prescriptive around. And so some of these themes that we find coming into focus have to do with privacy law. So since AI is so data dependent, can we use privacy law as a mechanism to control aspects of artificial intelligence, not necessarily as a technology, but the inputs that feed artificial intelligence? So if you haven't looked at it, it would be really interesting for you to look at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner's recommendation on reform to PIPEDA with a particular view to how artificial intelligence should be incorporated. And the reason I say this is because the OPC does a great job at unpacking some of the key concerns to do with privacy and artificial intelligence that as an intersection point. So you're going to be collecting and processing all of this information for the purposes of algorithmic training, development, deployment. What are the implications of that, even when that data is de-identified, ultimately to create some pretty specific predictions or profiles potentially on maybe not an individual per se, but on classifications of individuals? What are the implications of that from a values perspective? We also see specific risks so sectoral risks being identified. So we give the example here of broader regulation on software as a medical device. And, are there specific considerations that Health Canada has turned its mind to give guidance to those medical device producers in particular about how they are going to either create systems that are closed so that they may not be as subject to data drift or that interpretation of their data environment, hard to do. Otherwise, what does it mean to implement a medical device, a software-based medical device that's AI enabled, recognizing the fact that the intended purpose for which it was ultimately classified may change over time? How do you control against that? And importantly, what are the cybersecurity risks associated with that? So we see specific sort of sectoral or specific classifications of AI uses that are being regulated as well. We also see as a consistent theme this concept of professionalism. Are those developers of AI systems, procurers, users, are they properly qualified? Depending on the risk classification of that system, are they properly qualified to use that system? Are they properly qualified to monitor the use of that system to ensure the intended purpose is consistent and complies? So important themes. The other really important theme that you've already heard me touch on a little bit is to do with automated decision systems. We are seeing the law across different jurisdictions, as I mentioned, specifically zero in on the concept of the automated decision system and what are those positive obligations there. So effectively saying, we're not regulating the technology across the board, but we're saying in certain uses where we anticipate that the system will be used to make a prediction, make a recommendation, or make a decision, or assist in those, that in particular, we want to have some kind of positive obligation on those companies who are using these systems to be transparent and to keep an inventory of what those systems are, particularly where they are anticipated to have a significant impact on the individual. And that language I'm really drawing from Bill C-11, so that bill that was tabled in November that was intended to reform PIPEDA, or at least, that was what we had hoped was going to happen, but then it died on the order table when the election was called. So here we see some consistent themes already emerging in law. We know that in Canada, privacy law is very much evolving. So with the coming into force of Europe's GDPR, that's really stimulated a lot of discussion within Canada about whether our privacy laws need to be modernized, and if so, what that should look like. So the Bill C-11 is a great example of how, government has put together a proposal of what a reform could look like, a modernization of our federal private sector privacy laws could look like. We're told, based on the mandate letter to Minister Champagne, our innovation minister at the federal level, that I believe it's this quarter that we should be seeing a new bill tabled to reform PIPEDA. So we'll have to wait and see. But we are expecting something like Bill C-11 to be retabled at some point soon. We've seen some significant reform out of Quebec, as I've already mentioned. And we've also seen Ontario start consultations around privacy law for private sector as well, specific to that. It's sort of quieted down once Bill C-11 was tabled, so we'll see if they pick that up again. So far, suggestion is they might just wait, Ontario might wait and see what happens at the federal level and not yet push forward in a strong way a private sector privacy law. But you can really feel that movement and that evolution, the reactive nature of the law, trying to determine whether something new is needed, something more modern is needed, and if so, what that should look like, what standards should we align to, and how should we articulate some of those standards in the Canadian context in particular. Also out of BC and Alberta, some really interesting reform happening as well, with reviews of health and private sector. I mean, in the BC context, really looking at whether health law is needed and starting to actually unpack that, dig deep into what that should look like, with a proposal either tabled or coming soon, as I understand it. And then also at the federal level, what we see is an engagement by the government to in some ways lead on the adoption of artificial intelligence, not specific to health, but in so doing, putting forward a directive on automated decision making for the use of artificial intelligence within the federal government that is really persuasive outside the federal government. The directive provides risk assessment with corresponding actions depending on what the risk level of the system is. It's called an algorithmic impact assessment with the corresponding directive that gives guidance on what you should do depending on what the risk of the AI system is in its use case, so in how you intend to use that system. And that's really persuasive. When we look at other sectors, we're finding that, and frankly, other jurisdictions, we're finding that different governments, provincial, outside of Canada, are looking to the Directive on Automated Decision-Making as an example of a way to assess the risk of an AI system and then provide corresponding direction on what to do to de-risk, mitigate the risk of that system in particular. So lots happening in the Canadian space. It's happening in the regulatory capacity, legal capacity, and the policy space as well. When you look across all of these different changes that we just covered, it's really interesting what emerges as some of those key themes. So I've already touched on this, and some of them are procedural, more procedural nature, and then I'll cover also some that are a little bit more substantive in nature. So while not perfectly classified as procedural, what you see here is, as we discussed, there's a lot happening that's specific to automated decision systems. So we've also heard of different sectors regulating or different jurisdictions regulating the use of facial recognition technology, which would be sort of another example of something that's a little more text specific and it's got a specific regulation associated with it. We're not seeing that so much in the Canadian context. There's been a lot of obviously pushback on the use of facial recognition technology in the law enforcement context following the Clearview AI decision, but and the example there. But we're actually seeing more prescriptive regulation when it comes to automated decision systems. This is really important in the health context because an automated decision system, at least as defined under Bill C-11, was as broad as anything that assists or replaces in the judgment of a human decision maker. And from a tech perspective, was as broad as a rules-based system to a neural network. So very, very broad scope of what's being considered an automated decision system. And then of course, it's going to be rendering some type of prediction or recommendation or decision that's going to support that decision, the human decision maker, and ultimately actioning. So we see quite a bit happening in that particular space. We also see a lot of discussion happening on the concept of explainability. Again, check out the OPC's recommendation on privacy and AI for reform of privacy law for the context of artificial intelligence. This concept of explainability, transparency. Do I understand why the system rendered a particular decision? And if not, should you be allowed to use that type of system? Really, again, important in the healthcare context where there will be, depending on who the end user is, whether it's a clinician or it's a direct to consumer type or direct to patient type of system, being able to provide that level of explainability appropriate to the use of the system and appropriate to the context is really important. Also, justifying the decisions you make will be very important. OPC in particular picks up on this concept, and as well, we see this in Quebec as well, picks up on the concept of notice of interaction with an artificial intelligence system. So I should not be duped. If I'm interacting with a chatbot, I should know that very obviously. If I'm going to, if a AI system is going to render a decision on me, I should understand that right from the get-go. OPC then puts forward the recommendation that, well, there should be potentially a right to contest. A, to object to having that decision processed by an automated decision system, and then B, being able to contest the decision and in a meaningful capacity. So you can actually do something to change the outcome. So really important themes there, as well as super important, and from the privacy perspective, the concept of de-identification. So again, under Bill C-11, that definition of de-identification seems to have broadened and seems to now incorporate different components, a little bit aligning, it seems, with the European context that has de-identified through to anonymized with different requirements based on how your data is classified. We'll see what happens when the new bill is tabled, hopefully this quarter. But nevertheless, maintaining that strict use of de-identified data for specific cases, if you're not going to have consent with the appropriate exemptions, and then the risk around re-identification and what does all of this mean in the healthcare context. So in Canada, there's been some really interesting research produced around the use of synthetic data as an alternative to using sort of raw personal information, and really worth checking out if you've got any interest in building AI systems within your organization. On the more sort of substantive side, which you don't really see on these slides, but I just want to quickly touch on some of the key themes that we see emerging, again, have to do with transparency. So how open are you as an organization about your innovation agenda and about your use of AI systems, whether it's to internal stakeholders, maybe it's to your staff, clinicians, or whomever it may be, or to external stakeholders, and what are you doing to engage those stakeholders throughout the design and deployment process? So important considerations to think about, and certainly things that we'll cover throughout the course of these modules. Human-centric design and human-centric purpose. So this idea that we as humans continue to control our destinies and that we are using artificial intelligence as a tool, an enabler of some, and really to augment our capacities. Very important theme coming through substantively, and we see this in the legal context where we're really trying, you can see the laws really trying to align artificial intelligence and existing values, societal values, human rights values. The issue of professionalism that we've already touched on, and then accountability. So are you able to put in place, or have you put in place, a robust accountability governance structure that will help you as an organization really monitor the use of your systems? First of all, either procure or design well-intentioned, well-thought-through AI systems that will serve a valuable purpose and a valuable benefit, really important in the healthcare context in particular. So do you have that design? Can you demonstrate what due diligence you put into the design or procurement of those systems? And then ultimately, as the system is deployed, are you properly monitoring the use of those systems? Is the intended purpose consistent throughout the use of the system? Is there any drift that you need to be cautious of? And if so, are you decommissioning the system appropriately? Is there appropriate training for all those who are interacting with the system? Really important. Do not underestimate the value of change management throughout this entire process. From idea to implementation, change management within your organization and with external stakeholders is critical. So those are some of the additional substantive themes. And then, we really want to cover, well, why are these themes emerging? So again, let's unpack this a little more. When we think about human centricity, we want to make sure that the tools that we're putting in place actually advance our values, not subvert them. We want to make sure that we are not enabling we're preventing or protecting against bad actors using these technologies in a way that can be truly harmful to some of our values. So human centricity is a critical component of that. Trust and verify. I think that was the title of the OPC's annual report 2 years ago, or maybe it was more than that, but it's a really valuable concept, right? So yes, we have to enable and embolden trust in AI systems. We understand in the health context in particular, some of the social benefit can be enormous, and can really facilitate not only better patient outcome, but more efficient health systems. So we understand that there is value there, but we're not blind to the importance of some of the risks associated with the use of these systems. And so having in place that accountability structure that we will unpack more in module 6, so on March 3rd, unpacking that is going to be very important, and tailoring it to your organization is really important. And it takes a process. It's not something that you do in a lunchtime meeting. It's quite an engaged process. I mean, we're doing this at my firm with a number of healthcare organizations, and it really is an exercise of understanding how decisions are made, and then ensuring that there are appropriate questions, appropriate oversight, and then proper documentation throughout that decision-making process until you get to deployment. And then what does that control mechanism look like after the fact to make sure the systems are still aligned? So you're never quite off the hook there. Oh, I just went backwards by accident. Leading with transparency. This is a really, I keep saying it's a really important theme, but as it turns out, the concept of openness and being forthcoming about what you're doing, relying on open source technology where appropriate, or allowing your technology, if you're developing it, to be open source where appropriate, being open about what your innovation agenda looks like, and particularly what types of systems that you're investing in and why, is part of this accountability structure. So in particular, where you're looking at the use of automated decision systems in a clinical context in particular, as I said, you're going to want to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to be able to report on that. And the question then becomes, well, who gets the report? What does the report look like? How often do we have to, disclose to the public or to our stakeholders what we're doing? That will be an internal decision by your organization, but it is one that you have to make. That is something that needs to be built into and baked into your AI governance program, which you'll be hearing more and more about as artificial intelligence technology continues to take off. And then finally, really protecting those privacy interests. Privacy law is used as a tool to facilitate, enable, and protect important freedoms that we host in privacy, that allows us to be the individuals that allow our democracies to flourish. So baking that in from the outset of the design process is really going to be critical. And then integrating the privacy considerations throughout the design to deployment and monitoring of your AI system will be important from a regulatory perspective, but also from a trust building perspective. Have you really thought through the privacy implications? What does it mean? Who's getting that data? How are they going to be using it? And then what happens to it when it's no longer needed? So lots of questions to unpack in order to create sort of proactive compliance with emerging law. But something really important to think about is the law. We already know where the law is going. We can see this in, the 25 minutes or 30 minutes we've already had together. You can see consistent themes. You can start to see what the law is worried about, the concept of automated decision-making, the notion of transparency, the importance of explainability, the linking between advanced technologies and human rights, and sort of human values or societal values. We can see all of this coming together. And so then it becomes a question of, well, what do we do about it within our organization? There may not be strict requirements right now, privacy law excluded, but these are emerging and you can already see them. So as you start to build out your innovation agenda, I use that as a broad term because I think that there are, when we surveyed a number of healthcare organizations throughout Canada, they're at various ends of the spectrum from, more still sort of in the legacy space to using more advanced technology. And really whatever that agenda looks like for you and for your organization is going to be specific. So you're going to need to look internal to what you have going on, what your ambitions are with your data, how you want to position that with your stakeholders, and then start to build a program that not only addresses your existing needs, but certainly where you're planning to go in the next 3 to 5 years. So proactive compliance is going to be something that should be on one of the executive level or board agendas shortly. So what we find in the health context in particular is that we are seeing certain aspects of health being regulated, health and AI being regulated. The most striking really that we pulled out is in the context of software as a medical device. It's not the only one, but it is something that was quite striking when Health Canada issued new guidance about a year or two ago. They issued new guidance that aligns to an extent with what we see coming out of Europe and the US as well when it comes to software as a medical device. And really conscious of the continuously learning and adapting nature of AI systems. So again, when you're getting a medical device approved for the Canadian market, you have to first do that risk assessment of the medical device. And then if it falls within a particular risk category, there are other regulatory requirements that are associated. And so defining that intended purpose at the outset is so super important. Yet we know that there's a real risk with AI technologies or AI-enabled medical devices to have that intended purpose shift over time. So how does that have an impact on the risk classification of your device? Health Canada has given us some guidance about what producers should be doing in particular and how those devices can be managed over time. And then really advocating a life cycle approach, which is not at all specific to the medical device. A life cycle approach to AI risk management is adopted in all jurisdictions that we've talked about. And it is recognizing that an AI system can evolve over time and can shift in its focus. So really being able to take that life cycle approach and understand it at various points, and then continuing that until it's ultimately decommissioned, if ever. The other area that we will just quickly touch on, recognizing time, is that of physician liability. So just something to say here, it's always fun to look back and say, how has the standard of care for physicians evolved over time? And, you know, the use of technology is nothing new in the concept of physician liability. So when we first started using X-rays or ultrasound machines, you know, in the early stages, they weren't considered to be so formative to the sort of standard of care at the time. And then over time, it actually they did become baked into that standard of care analysis. And the anticipation is that we'll start to see this more and more in the AI context as well. And we've seen actually some really great articles out of Canadian medical associations and journals that have contemplated this concept of, you know, if a physician has access to an AI system that could potentially be more accurate or potentially be faster and chooses not to do it or use it, then is that an example of negligence or not? No definitive answer on that yet, but something that's emerging, and we can start to anticipate where it's going. So on the horizon, we see the regulatory landscape of AI is quite fluid. It's certainly evolving, and I would really encourage you to keep your eye on it, because proactive compliance will prevent you from having to retroactively go back and tweak some of your governance systems in particular. No doubt you're all building or have built robust data governance systems. And if you have, or if you are, then now is a great time to bake in some of those specific AI considerations. It will certainly align you very nicely to where regulation is coming, and it's not far off. We're not talking 10 years down the road. We're talking, you know, at most 3 to 4, where we will have some, or in some contexts, it's already here, where we will have meaningful regulation prescription around what you can and can't do, or what is expected of you if you're using a particular system. We're also seeing specific laws emerge slowly in the health sector. We see this a little bit out of Quebec with Bill 19, and then certainly reform to PHIPA contemplating the use of commercial. So it's not exactly AI specifically, but certainly there's more of a discussion about should a privacy health law like PHIPA start to be more modernized even further to consider aspects of advanced technology. Arguably, there are elements of it that are already baked in. And we also see policy guidance on governance from a risk-based approach. So again, something that we're going to look at in detail on March 3rd. And we'll cover parts of it throughout, so please do tune in every Thursday. But really on March 3rd, trying to unpack what does that AI governance structure look like? What are some of the key considerations, at least to spark discussion? So not trying to provide the prescriptive answer on what to do, but certainly to spark some discussion within your organization about what will work well for you, and based on what your agenda, sort of your data ambitions are, but also based on the maturity of your organization in the use of data and technology together. We're seeing increased investments in privacy preserving technologies like synthetic data is one example that I've referenced. And we're seeing more practical experimentation in the AI sector, the health sector with AI enabled technologies. If you have any great examples that you would want to share, InfoWaste certainly encourages you to do so. And they will put their email address in the chat where you can contribute your use case of what your organization may be doing to advance artificial intelligence in the health sector. If you read the toolkit, you'll find that it surveys examples from Newfoundland through to Vancouver, coast to coast, really trying to highlight what community hospitals are doing as well as some research institutions. Finally, some major research and development happening in the AI space, specifically for health. So COVID very much accelerated that investment portfolio for AI and health products or med tech products, and it hasn't stopped ever since. So it's been a really strong, Canada as well, really strong investments in health technology with AI-enabled health tech. You'll start to hear AI in everything going forward. It will become that thing that always pops up wherever you go, and that's because it really is becoming more and more prominent as a valuable technology to support better patient outcomes and more efficient health systems. So with that, I will open the floor. I'll turn it back to Brad and open the floor for any questions that the audience may have. I really welcome the contribution that you have, any questions, and certainly look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Carol. And we have a question or two and a comment or two, and we've actually got some backup questions. So I encourage people to ask questions. Derek asked a question, and it was really a question, it was a comment about where privacy and healthcare interact with AI, and his angle was related to training sets and de-identified data. But it occurs to me things like automated decision making and explainability, that's kind of one area of AI. The whole area of privacy and personal health information is another. And these two areas are coming together. And can you just talk about what that means? Like, we have a lot of moving parts from a privacy perspective, and we're just starting down this AI perspective. How do these things kind of begin to play together?
It's a really great question, because already when you look at it from a privacy perspective, you have overlapping jurisdictions. So you've got federal, in some cases you have provincial privacy laws. Depending on the sector, you may have a specific provincial privacy law. And so the landscape is actually pretty complicated. What we're going to find is that, and then if you actually look at that internationally, it becomes even more complicated. In the US, it may be federal if it's health, and then there may be associated state laws. So from a pure privacy perspective, the law is already complicated. Then what we're going to find is that there are specific regulations to do with artificial intelligence defined differently. So what constitutes AI will change depending on jurisdiction. And that will be, you will overlay that over the sort of privacy law. So you will have to consider the implication, the intersection of law at various points. So when you're talking about privacy law, and one more thing, we are also seeing an emergence of more data governance law. So we see a little bit of this out of the EU, which means you're not only governing personal information, but also potentially non-personal information. So any data is going to be governed as an asset. With all of that, you then have your AI law that is going to, if Europe is any example, it will provide prescription to providers and users of AI systems as to how they can conduct an appropriate risk and impact assessment of their AI system in context. So how it will be used, what is the use case? And then what is the sort of monitoring and control program that needs to be put in place to ensure that your system is compliant. And Europe is even suggesting an early conformity assessment. You can't enter the market unless you pass that conformity assessment. All to say, lots going on, lots to keep your eye on. And if you know, I always love simplicity. I always say simplicity wins. Well, that's not going to happen here. It's going to be a period of time where we're waiting for the law to evolve. First of all, we're waiting for it to be put into place. Then we have to wait for it to evolve. And we have to recognize that it will differ from jurisdiction. So we'll need to make some risk decisions as organizations, depending on the sort of global nature of your company or your organization.
Great. So if you have a look at the toolkit, we actually have a little more detail on some of the specific regulations and laws that are in place province by province at the federal government. And that's a moving target. Like it's a snapshot in time, but that might give people a starting point. Carol, one of the questions we get on a regular basis is, what's the difference in your mind between a very sophisticated Excel spreadsheet that contains personal health information and helps assist making decisions, and something that implements artificial intelligence with machine language kind of more fully bloomed? And where, like, what's the significant 1 or 2 or 3 features that you think really calls out what's really interesting about AI? I think you've already answered it, but just to put a real exclamation mark on it.
So I sort of want to answer it in 2 ways. The first is, if something like Bill C-11 passes, what will the law tell us is interesting about it? And the law will say in that respect, assuming all things stay as it was in the draft, that it sort of doesn't matter if you've got that advanced Excel spreadsheet or you have your neural net, if it is assisting or replacing in the judgment of a human decision maker, those are the words, then you have positive obligations to maintain an inventory and to ensure explainability where it's expected to have a significant impact on the individual. So that's what the law will tell you if it passes as it's expected or as it was written. What I would say, if you were to step back a little bit, is, you know, these systems can be extremely complicated. The more complicated it is, you fall more and more into that question of how explainable is it? How much training do you need to understand the system and the output? What does the professionalism need to look like for that user who's receiving the output? And what is the context? So how impactful will it be on the individual who's ultimately who's impacted by that output, that decision? If you look at, for example, the newly tabled Algorithmic Accountability Act, it's a new bill that was tabled in the US. It actually was tabled in 2019, it died, and then has just been retabled again, I think yesterday or the day before. And you can sort of start to answer that question in a different way, which is, there's a lot of concern that because of the sophisticated nature of the technology, that AI component, we don't necessarily understand why the output is rendered. It does have or could have a significant impact on the individual, and the law as drafted is not strong enough to provide protection from that harm. So, you know, over time, that question will become a little bit less of, at least from my perspective, a little bit less of an ethics policy discussion. In my world, it will become more of a legal interpretation question where we have to drill down on what do the draft laws require us to do, and can we anticipate where actual law is going? And I think we can.
Okay. Thanks, Carol. Hey, Carol, a really interesting question from Andrea about the use of privacy enhancing technology and legislation. Have you got a sense about whether that's an aspect that emerging regulation looks at and legislation looks at, so the whole PET world?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, again, that's where you're looking at the definition of de-identification, sort of. So you're looking at 2 aspects: the extent to which the data is appropriately de-identified, meaning all direct identifiers or all linkability identifiers are removed. And that, again, depends on jurisdiction. It depends what you consider to be de-identification. And again, it depends on whether bill, sort of the wording in Bill C-11 will continue to hold in the new, whatever the new bill looks like. But so there's that component of, well, what is the analysis around de-identification? And then what is the analysis around the risk of re-identification? So PIPEDA is sort of silent on that component, but the Privacy Commissioner was drawing inspiration from PHIPAA, from Ontario's health privacy law, to look at the definition of de-identification that links that, you know, reasonable foreseeability of re-identification in that definition. And the reason I raise this is because privacy enhancing technologies, depending on which one you're talking about, will have a different implication under the potential law, under what it could look like, because it really does depend on what you're using. So if you're using pure synthetic data, then arguably, and I would love to have some of the thought leaders on synthetic data here to probably do a much better job than I could ever do on explaining it. But if you're using synthetic data, then arguably you're not using any personal information. So you should fall well outside the confines or the sort of parameters of privacy law, and you should be able to use it. There are considerations there that you need a technical expert to tell you about, right? That's who I would sit down with and get information from. But that might be a way that you are still maintaining the privacy while drawing the insights from the data. There are other technologies or methodologies like differential privacy where that question is still it's still being tested in the world of privacy law. Like, how comfortable are we? This, you know, differential privacy is presented as a guarantee, a mathematical guarantee in privacy preserving. But there are decisions that you need to make in order to ensure that privacy preserving component. So it's a really interesting area of study and an interesting area of policy. We don't have clear guidance on, you know, how exactly PETs will be considered by the OPC, for instance.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Look, there are a few more questions we're not going to be able to get to today from Tibor and Mohammed, likely a few others. I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. We're going to capture these questions. We're going to figure out the best way to handle them going forward. We've included our email address here today. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please send them through. Again, we're just a little plug for the toolkit, a bit more information in there. We'll send a post-webinar survey to follow up on. So I think we'd really love the feedback. We responded to some in the first part. We have 3 more webinars coming up. Every Thursday, 12 to 1 Toronto time. Please attend. We're just trying to get the right information out to you at the right time. And thanks so much for everyone's time today. And Carol, thanks to you for helping us out. I really appreciate it. Okay, everyone, have a great rest of the day. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.